married me just to fund his mistress. Then I turned the tables on him in court. The words that had become my personal mantra over the past 6 months echoed in my mind as I straightened my charcoal gray blazer and smoothed down my pencil skirt. The courthouse loomed before me, its imposing stone facade a fitting backdrop for what would surely be the final act in the tragicomedy that had become my marriage. 3 years ago, I had walked down the aisle toward Richard Bennett, believing I was marrying the love of my life. At 42, I had almost given up on finding someone who could appreciate my practical nature, my dedication to my accounting career, and my carefully amassed financial portfolio. Richard had seemed perfect, charming, attentive, and apparently smitten with me despite being 5 years my junior. What I didn't realize then was that the gleam in his eyes wasn't love, but calculation. Behind his warm smiles and passionate declarations lurked a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a meal ticket, a convenient source of funding for the double life he had been living all along. The discovery had come 9 months into our marriage, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had left work early due to a migraine, something I rarely experienced. The house should have been empty, as Richard typically worked until 6 p.m. at the architectural firm where he was a partner. Or so I thought. The unfamiliar woman's shoes in our entryway were my first clue that something was amiss. Then came the sounds, unmistakable, intimate noises emanating from our bedroom upstairs. Frozen in disbelief, I stood in the hallway, my migraine suddenly forgotten as adrenaline coursed through my veins. I could have confronted them then, thrown open the door and created the kind of dramatic scene worthy of a daytime soap opera. Instead, something cold and calculating took over, a part of me I hadn't known existed until that moment. Silently, I retreated, taking only my laptop and purse before leaving the house as quietly as I had entered. Richard never knew I had come home early that day, never realized his carefully constructed facade had begun to crumble. Instead of confrontation, I chose investigation. Years of forensic accounting had taught me that numbers never lie, even when people do. That evening, from a hotel room paid for with cash, I began digging into our finances with the methodical precision that had made me successful in my career. What I uncovered in the following weeks was more devastating than the affair itself. Richard had been systematically siphoning money from our joint accounts I had foolishly established shortly after our wedding, believing that complete financial merging was a sign of trust and commitment. Small transfers at first, then larger sums as his confidence grew. The money trail led to a luxury apartment in the city, expensive gifts, lavish vacations, all for a woman named Cassandra Winters. According to the lease agreement I eventually uncovered, they had been together for 5 years. Their relationship had not ended when Richard pursued me. It had merely shifted into a different phase, one where I unwittingly became the financier of their romance. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the infidelity, but because of the calculated nature of Richard's deception. Everything, his pursuit of me, the whirlwind romance, the heartfelt proposal, had been a performance designed to access my wealth. At 47, he had looked at me and seen not a woman to love, but a solution to his financial problems. His architectural firm was failing, a fact he had carefully concealed during our courtship. His charming bachelor pad had been mortgaged to the hilt. His expensive tastes had left him drowning in credit card debt. I had been his lifeline, his unwitting benefactor, the perfect mark. For 3 weeks, I continued the charade of our marriage while secretly building my case. I documented every financial transaction, photographed bank statements, recorded dates and times of his late nights at the office that cell phone records showed were spent at Cassandra's apartment. I consulted with a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague, Lydia Martinez, a shark in designer clothing who listened to my story with narrowed eyes and a growing smile that would have terrified me under different circumstances. Lydia had been blunt in her assessment. You have a strong case for financial fraud and marital misconduct, but if you want to truly make him pay, we need more. More meant continuing the performance, pretending I suspected nothing while gathering evidence of his larger scheme. It meant smiling through dinner parties where he charmed our friends while his hand rested possessively on my shoulder. It meant enduring his touch in our bed, fighting the revulsion that threatened to betray my knowledge. "Think of it as an investment," Lydia had advised. "Every day you maintain this charade is another nail in his coffin when we finally get to court." And so I had played the role of devoted wife by day while working with private investigators and forensic accountants by night. What we uncovered went beyond simple infidelity or financial betrayal. Richard had a history of this behavior. 2 previous marriages to wealthy women, both ending in divorce after he had extracted significant financial benefit. In one case, he had left his ex-wife nearly bankrupt. He was, in the clinical terms used by the psychiatric expert Lydia later consulted, a probable sociopath with a pattern of predatory financial behavior. The final straw, the discovery that transformed my simmering anger into cold resolve, came 4 months into my investigation. While searching through Richard's home office during one of his business trips, actually a weekend in wine country with Cassandra, meticulously documented by my private investigator, I found a journal hidden in a locked drawer. The journal contained not heartfelt musings or guilty confessions, but something far more disturbing. Detailed notes on my financial situation, predating our relationship, strategies for gaining my trust, and a projected timeline for what he called the investment period and the eventual payout, the divorce he planned to initiate once he had legally secured a substantial portion of my assets. There, in his precise architectural handwriting, was the blueprint of my destruction. My marriage had never been real. I had never been loved, only targeted. Suddenly, without warning, the last shred of doubt or hope vanished, replaced by a clarity so profound it was almost transcendent. Armed with this evidence, Lydia and I finalized our strategy. The timing had to be perfect. Richard was planning to file for divorce in approximately 2 months, according to his journal. His calculations showed that the length of our marriage would by then entitle him to the maximum possible financial benefit under our state's laws. We needed to strike first, not just with divorce proceedings but with criminal charges of fraud. For the plan to work, Richard could not suspect that I knew anything until the moment the trap closed around him. This meant maintaining the fiction of our marriage more convincingly than ever, even as I systematically moved my most valuable assets out of his reach through legal channels Lydia had devised. It meant smiling when he brought me flowers just because, knowing the credit card statement would show he had purchased 2 identical bouquets that day. It meant listening to his excuses for late nights and unexpected trips, pretending to believe every word, while the voice recorder hidden in my jewelry captured each lie. The day of reckoning arrived exactly 5 weeks before Richard planned to serve me with divorce papers, according to his journal's timeline. I had arranged to leave for a spa weekend with friends, a rare indulgence that Richard had encouraged, likely seeing it as an opportunity for uninterrupted time with Cassandra. Instead of driving to the spa, however, I checked into a hotel across town. Then I called Richard's cell phone. "There's an emergency with our house," I told him, my voice convincingly frantic. "A pipe has burst in the main bathroom. The security system alerted me, and I've called emergency services, but someone needs to meet them there. I'm 3 hours away at the spa. Can you go?" His hesitation was brief but noticeable. He was with her, as expected. But the thought of potential damage to our home, to his investment, was enough to send him rushing back. What Richard didn't know was that there was indeed someone waiting at our house, a process server accompanied by 2 police officers, ready to present him with divorce papers, a restraining order, and a notice of criminal charges for financial fraud. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a legal battle that would consume the next 6 months of my life. Richard fought back with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal. He hired an aggressive attorney who painted me as a vindictive wife, manufacturing accusations against an innocent husband. He claimed the journal was a work of fiction, part of a novel he was writing. He produced witnesses, friends I had once trusted, who testified to his character and devotion. He even claimed that I had known about Cassandra all along, that we had an arrangement which I was now using against him out of spite. The emotional toll was immense. There were days when I questioned whether the fight was worth it, whether it might be easier to accept a settlement and move on with my life. But each time doubt crept in, I would reread his journal, reminding myself of the calculated way he had targeted me, used me, planned to discard me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice, about ensuring that Richard Bennett couldn't do to another woman what he had done to me. Today marked the culmination of that fight, the final day of our court proceedings, when the judge would render a decision on both the divorce settlement and the criminal charges. The courtroom was more crowded than usual. Our case had attracted attention due to the unusual nature of the fraud charges in what had begun as a seemingly routine divorce. I could feel eyes on me as I walked down the center aisle, some sympathetic, others curious, a few hostile, friends of Richard's who believed his version of events. I kept my head high, my expression composed. Richard sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed as always, his posture radiating confidence he surely couldn't feel given the mountain of evidence against him. Our eyes met briefly as I took my seat beside Lydia. There was no remorse in his gaze, only cold calculation, still assessing whether he could find some way to benefit from this situation. Even now, facing potential criminal penalties, he was looking for an angle, an escape route, a profit. The judge entered and we all rose. Judge Eleanor Watkins was in her 60s, with a reputation for thoroughness and a distaste for deception in her courtroom. Throughout the proceedings, her penetrating questions had suggested she saw through Richard's performance of wounded innocence. As we retook our seats, I felt a curious calm settle over me. Whatever happened today, I had reclaimed my agency. I had refused to be a victim. The financial cost of this legal battle had been significant, but the alternative, allowing Richard to execute his plan, would have been far more devastating, both economically and emotionally. Judge Watkins adjusted her glasses and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. After careful consideration of all evidence presented in the divorce proceedings of Bennett versus Bennett, as well as the related criminal complaints, I am prepared to render my decision. The courtroom fell silent, the tension almost palpable. Richard leaned forward slightly, his attorney placing a restraining hand on his arm. In the matter of the divorce, Judge Watkins began, her voice clear and authoritative. This court finds overwhelming evidence of marital misconduct and financial fraud on the part of the respondent, Richard Bennett. The systematic diversion of marital assets to support an extramarital relationship constitutes a clear breach of fiduciary duty. Furthermore, the documentary evidence, particularly the respondent's own written records, demonstrates that the marriage itself was entered into under fraudulent pretenses, with the specific intent of financial exploitation. She paused, looking directly at Richard over the rim of her glasses. This court rarely sees such calculated predatory behavior in family court proceedings. Mr. Bennett's actions represent an egregious abuse of the marital relationship. My heart was pounding so loudly I feared others might hear it, but I maintained my composed exterior as Judge Watkins continued. Therefore, the court grants the divorce on grounds of fraud and adultery. All assets that Ms. Harriman brought into the marriage will be returned to her sole possession. Additionally, Mr. Bennett will be responsible for reimbursing the sum of $275,000, representing marital assets inappropriately diverted for personal use. A small gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richard's face had gone pale, the confidence draining away as Judge Watkins methodically dismantled his future. But she wasn't finished. Regarding the criminal complaints, she continued, this court finds sufficient evidence to support charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation. These findings will be referred to the district attorney's office with this court's recommendation for prosecution. She fixed Richard with a stern gaze. Mr. Bennett, you have abused the trust of your spouse, this court, and the institution of marriage itself. While the criminal proceedings will determine the full extent of your penalty, this court is imposing the maximum civil penalties allowed. There was more. Details of asset division, timelines for payment, restrictions on Richard's financial activities pending criminal proceedings, but I barely heard them through the roaring in my ears. Victory was complete, more decisive than even Lydia had predicted. When Judge Watkins finally said, This court is adjourned. The sharp crack of her gavel seemed to break something loose inside me. Not grief or anger, but relief so profound it was almost physical. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Richard remained seated, seemingly stunned by the totality of his defeat. His attorney was speaking urgently in his ear, but he appeared not to hear. When he finally looked up, his eyes sought mine across the room. For the first time since I'd known him, there was no mask, no performance, just the naked rage of a predator denied his prey. I held his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. He married me just to fund his mistress. Then I turned the tables on him in court. The thought flashed through my mind again, but now it wasn't a battle cry or a promise of retribution. It was simply a statement of fact, the conclusion to a chapter of my life that was finally, decisively closed. As I gathered my belongings to leave, a woman approached hesitantly, mid-30s, expensively dressed, visibly uncomfortable. "Miss Harriman, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you. About Richard. About—" She faltered, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "About his pattern." The conversation with Elise Donovan, who introduced herself as Richard's girlfriend before Cassandra, continued over coffee at a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse. As she shared her story, distressingly similar to my own experience, I realized that Richard's journal had been accurate in one respect. I hadn't been his first target, merely his most recent and potentially most lucrative. Elise had escaped with less financial damage, having discovered his infidelity before he could implement the full extent of his plan, but the emotional scars were evident in her tense posture and the way her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. "I saw your case in the news," she explained. "I recognized his methods immediately, the love bombing, the rushed intimacy, the subtle questions about finances disguised as plans for the future." She paused, studying my face. "You're not what I expected. When I was with Richard, he described his ex-wife as hysterical, vindictive. I assumed you'd be the same." "That's part of his technique," I replied, recognizing the manipulation tactic. "He isolates his targets, makes them believe that any woman who speaks against him is unstable or malicious. It prevents his victims from comparing notes, from seeing the pattern." Elise nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Exactly. When things ended between us, he told everyone I was mentally unbalanced, that I'd invented accusations because I couldn't accept the breakup. Some mutual friends still won't speak to me." She hesitated, then added, "There are others, you know, before me, at least 2 that I know of. One lost nearly everything." A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Richard's journal had hinted at previous investments, but hearing confirmation from Elise made the scope of his predation suddenly sickeningly real. "We should find them," I said, the decision crystallizing even as I spoke the words. "All of his victims, not just for the criminal case, though their testimony would certainly strengthen it, but for themselves, for closure." That conversation with Elise marked the beginning of what would become known in our small circle as the Reclamation Project. Over the following months, as Richard awaited trial on criminal charges, Elise and I located 3 other women who had been targeted by him in varying degrees. Patricia had been married to him for 4 years, losing her inherited family home and nearly $500,000 before escaping. Jennifer had broken their engagement after discovering messages to another woman but still blamed herself for overreacting. Sarah had been the earliest victim we could find, a successful restaurateur whose business had collapsed after Richard convinced her to invest in non-existent property developments. Each woman's story contained the same elements: Richard's charm, the whirlwind romance, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the subtle questioning about assets, the careful cultivation of trust, and finally, the systematic extraction of resources. Working with Lydia, who took on the project pro bono after hearing the expanded scope of Richard's activities, we built a comprehensive case that extended far beyond my original complaints. The district attorney, initially hesitant to allocate significant resources to what appeared to be a matrimonial dispute, became increasingly engaged as the pattern of predatory behavior emerged through documented evidence from multiple victims. By the time Richard's criminal trial began 8 months after our divorce was finalized, the charges had expanded to include multiple counts of fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, in Patricia's case, as she had been recovering from cancer treatment when Richard targeted her, and even racketeering, given the organized, ongoing nature of his scheme. The media attention grew, with several national news programs featuring segments on romance scammers and financial predators who used marriage as their weapon of choice. Cassandra, Richard's mistress during our marriage, eventually came forward as well, though her story diverged significantly from the others. According to her tearful testimony, she had believed Richard was separated or in the process of divorcing each of his wives. He had portrayed himself as the victim of gold diggers and unstable women, using Cassandra as both emotional support and occasional financial backup when his schemes hit temporary setbacks. "I thought I was helping a good man escape toxic relationships," she testified, avoiding my gaze across the courtroom. "I never knew I was participating in fraud." Whether she had been another victim or a willing accomplice remained ambiguous, but her testimony further illuminated Richard's methods of manipulation and deception. The prosecution used bank records to show how money flowed from each wife to Richard, then partially to Cassandra in the form of gifts, travel, and living expenses. A financial shell game designed to maximize his benefit while maintaining her loyalty. Throughout the criminal proceedings, Richard maintained his innocence, his demeanor shifting from indignant to wounded, depending on which emotion he calculated would be most effective with the jury. He claimed the journal detailing his plans was a creative writing exercise. He suggested that his ex-wives and girlfriends had conspired against him out of jealousy or vindictiveness. He even attempted to paint himself as the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by me, a desperate gambit that fell apart under cross-examination when confronted with bank records showing systematic transfers from my accounts to shell companies he controlled. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 37 of the 41 charges. As the foreman read out guilty again and again, I watched Richard's facade finally crumble completely, revealing the hollow core beneath his charming exterior. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Marcus Thompson showed little mercy, imposing a 12-year prison sentence and restitution requirements that ensured Richard would emerge from incarceration with no financial benefit from his crimes. The conclusion of the criminal case brought a sense of justice, but for the 5 of us, Richard's known victims, the emotional and financial aftermath remained to be navigated. We continued to meet regularly, first as part of the legal proceedings and later as a support group of sorts. Patricia, who had lost the most financially, struggled with trust issues that affected her ability to form new relationships. Jennifer, the youngest among us, channeled her experience into an educational initiative, speaking at colleges about recognizing the warning signs of financial predators. Sarah, who had begun rebuilding her restaurant business, offered jobs to several of us during transitions, creating an unexpected professional network from our shared trauma. Elise, with her background in marketing, helped craft a media strategy that transformed our individual experiences into a platform for awareness, without reducing us to stereotypical victims in the public eye. And I found myself increasingly drawn to advocacy, working with legislative groups to strengthen legal protections against this specific type of fraud. 1 year after Richard's sentencing, the 5 of us gathered at Sarah's newly reopened restaurant for what had become a monthly dinner. The conversation flowed easily now, no longer dominated by legal strategies or processing grief, but focused increasingly on our present lives and future plans. As we shared a bottle of champagne, a ritual that had begun with Richard's conviction, I looked around the table at these women who had started as strangers, united only by a common deceiver. "To turning the tables," Sarah proposed, raising her glass in what had become our traditional toast. "And to reclaiming our stories," I added, thinking of how differently things might have gone if I had confronted Richard that first day instead of methodically building my case. If I had acted from emotion rather than calculation, if I had accepted the role of victim rather than becoming the architect of justice. "He married me just to fund his mistress," Then I turned the tables on him in court. The phrase that had once been a promise of retribution had evolved into something more powerful, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed deception could be unraveled by determination, solidarity, and strategic thinking. As our dinner concluded and we prepared to go our separate ways, Patricia to her therapy session, Jennifer to review applications for her foundation scholarship program, Sarah to close the restaurant, Elise to finalize designs for a new client campaign, and me to complete my testimony for an upcoming legislative hearing, I reflected on Richard's legacy in our lives. He had intended to take from each of us money, security, confidence, trust. Instead, he had inadvertently given us something valuable: a network of formidable women who had not merely survived his predation, but had transformed it into a platform for change. The financial loss had been substantial for all of us, though the court-ordered restitution would eventually recover some of it. The emotional cost had been even greater, but as we hugged goodbye in the warm spring evening, I realized that we had all found our way to the same liberating truth. Our value had never been determined by Richard's assessment, and our stories had never been limited to the chapters in which he appeared. In the quiet of my apartment that night, I removed the last physical reminder of Richard from my life. The wedding band I had continued to wear during the investigation and trials, as a symbol not of commitment, but of resolve. For months after the divorce, I had kept it in my jewelry box, uncertain why I was unable to sell it or discard it. Now, looking at the simple gold circle, I finally understood. It had been a talisman of sorts, a tangible reminder of both betrayal and triumph. But I no longer needed physical objects to remember what I had learned or what I had accomplished. The lessons had been integrated into who I had become. The next morning, I donated the ring to a women's shelter that provided emergency financial assistance to those escaping abusive situations. The symmetry felt right, transforming a symbol of financial exploitation into a resource for those seeking freedom. The shelter director, unaware of my personal history, thanked me warmly. "Every donation helps someone rewrite their story," she said. I smiled, thinking how accurately she had captured the essence of my journey. "Yes," I agreed. "That's exactly what it's for." Richard's sentencing had not been the end of the story, but rather the beginning of its second act. The media attention surrounding the case had opened doors I never anticipated. A literary agent approached me about writing a book detailing not just Richard's crimes, but the systematic way we had built our case against him. Initially hesitant to keep revisiting painful memories, I eventually agreed. After discussing it with the other women, we decided to collaborate on the project, each contributing a chapter about our experiences and the recovery process. The resulting book, Turning the Tables: How 5 Women Exposed a Predator, became an unexpected bestseller and, more importantly, a resource for others facing similar situations. Television appearances followed, along with speaking engagements and consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies seeking to better understand and combat romance-based financial fraud. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had evolved into a mission that extended far beyond my individual experience. 3 years after my divorce was finalized, I received a letter from the federal prison where Richard was serving his sentence. My first instinct was to discard it unopened, to refuse him any access to my thoughts or emotions. But after consultation with my therapist, a relationship that had been essential to my healing process, I decided to read it, prepared for manipulation or blame-shifting. Instead, I found something unexpected: a confession. Whether motivated by genuine remorse or simply the boredom and restriction of prison life, Richard had written a detailed account of his methodology, the psychological tactics he employed, and the warning signs he deliberately created and then explained away. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote toward the end of the 10-page letter. "I'm not even asking for a response. But if this information helps prevent someone else from doing what I did, or helps potential victims recognize the pattern earlier, then perhaps some small good can come from the harm I've caused." After careful consideration, I shared the letter with Lydia, who in turn provided it to the prosecutor's office. The insights it contained were eventually incorporated into law enforcement training materials, stripped of identifying details, but retaining the valuable perspective of the predator himself. Life moved forward in ways I could never have predicted during those dark days of discovery and deception. The professional network that had formed among Richard's victims led to new career opportunities. Sarah and I eventually became business partners in a venture capital firm specifically focused on women-owned businesses. Patricia, after intensive therapy, found love again with a widower who approached relationships with the same caution and respect she had learned to require. Jennifer's educational foundation expanded to 3 states, providing both awareness campaigns and emergency financial assistance to victims of romance fraud. Elise met and married a woman who supported her healing journey with patience and understanding. As for me, I discovered that the skills I had developed during my investigation, tenacity, strategic thinking, attention to detail, and the ability to recognize patterns in behavior and financial transactions, translated perfectly to my new role, identifying promising investments and protecting them from predatory business practices. On the 5th anniversary of the court decision that had ended one chapter of my life and begun another, I stood at the podium of a conference center, addressing a room full of financial advisors, legal professionals, and law enforcement officers. The most dangerous predators, I told them, are those who weaponize our deepest human desires, for connection, for partnership, for love. They study their targets carefully, customizing their approach to exploit specific vulnerabilities. They use trust not just as a means of access but as a shield against suspicion. But they also leave patterns, evidence, inconsistencies, and when their victims reclaim their power, gather that evidence and work together, the tables can be turned. I paused, looking out at the attentive faces. Today, I'll share how 5 women transformed individual victimization into collective action, and how professionals like you can help others do the same. As I launched into the presentation I had given dozens of times before, I felt the familiar sense of purpose that had replaced the shame and anger of my early discovery. The final slide of my presentation always contained the same phrase, the words that had evolved from an angry promise to a mission statement to, finally, an accomplished fact. He married me just to fund his mistress. Then I turned the tables on him in court. It stood as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed deceptions could be unraveled, that predators could be held accountable, and that those targeted could reclaim not just their resources, but their sense of agency and self-worth. As the audience applauded, I gathered my materials, ready to continue the work that had unexpectedly become my calling, helping others recognize, escape, and recover from the Richard Bennetts of the world. The woman I had been 5 years ago, standing shell-shocked in my own hallway after discovering the betrayal, could never have imagined this outcome. But then transformation rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes it requires us to walk through fire, to face our worst fears, to steel ourselves for battle, and sometimes, on the other side of that journey, we find not just healing but purpose, not just recovery but reinvention,